Hello and welcome. My name is Jennifer Findley and I'm the editor-in-chief of Mercer Law Review. Robert Johnson, our lead articles editor, and I are very excited to welcome you on behalf of Mercer Law and the Law Review to the 2013 Mercer Law Review Symposium, Current Trends in International Trade and Their Impact on Multinational Business. We know this symposium will prove to be an exciting hotbed of ideas and information that will inspire and challenge us all. It is my honor to officially open the symposium. Just a few formalities before we begin. Although each of our panelists and moderators are experts and have achieved great prestige in their respective fields, but in order to avoid long introductions, we decided to expedite the process and get to the meat of the presentation by including biographical information that we've handed out to all of you. This biographical information tells you about the panelists and moderators, and I encourage you to familiarize yourselves with it. But without further ado, I'm honored to introduce you to a man that has been instrumental in the organization and development of this symposium from its inception to today. He said to me one day, as we are in the initial stages of planning the symposium, Jennifer, there is a fascinating world out there called international trade. Today's presiding chair, a distinguished alumnus of Mercer Law, and a co-editor-in-chief of Volume 18 of the Mercer Law Review, a leader in the field of international trade, and a partner with Brian Cave, Mr. Joel Williams, will be presiding over the symposium today. So please allow me to welcome him. Professor Titshaw will be moderating this first panel. So without further ado, we'll get started today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Jennifer. Glad to see everyone out there today. We're excited about this panel, and you've heard a little bit about Joel Williams, who's going to be our first speaker today. He's a Mercer alumnus and a partner at Brian Cave. He's going to start us off by talking about the situation that existed before the World Trade Organization and some more recent treaties over the last generation came into effect, and setting a picture for us. Then Greg Desautels, to Joel's right, to your left, who is an international consultant based in Atlanta and the former executive director of International Mergers for Superior Essex, Inc., is going to be giving us a bit of a practical business perspective on what's transpiring with regard to international trade, on some current practices, and some trends, including some that are positive for the United States, potentially. And then our third presenter is John Linarelli, who's a professor of law and legal theory and the dean of Swansea Law School in the United Kingdom in Wales, I should mention. John is going to take a step back from the discussion that Joel and Greg enter into, and going to give us sort of a bigger picture view of some macro trends and some of the movement towards bilateralism and regional trade agreements, and where we may be going in the future with regard to international trade. I wanted to mention one more thing before I hand things over to Joel, which is we have a slightly unusual procedure in this panel, which is if you want to ask a question, and I encourage you to do that, there should be some cards out there available for you, and you could write your question on the card and hand it to one of our law review students who will be on the lookout for you. And they'll be passed to me, and we will discuss those questions, or all of them that we have time for, when we get to that section of our presentation. So thank you very much, and with no further ado, Joel Williams will begin our discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor. I want to thank everyone for being here. Also, I want to particularly thank our speakers, our panelists, all of the moderators who come from different places and who themselves are very distinguished, and we appreciate their time, their effort, and of course their support. One thing, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history of trade and where we are, where we were. I told you when you get old, you have a lot of experience. In my case, I was with an international sugar company for 26 years. We dealt with international trade every day in all parts of the world. But one of the most fascinating things was to be a part of the negotiations in the mid-'70s and late '70s of the International Sugar Agreement, and again, negotiations in Geneva in the early '80s, renegotiations of that treaty, and then George Bush, who I'd known when I was in Washington with Senator Russell, when he became president, he appointed me one of the advisors, industry advisors, to both NAFTA and GATT. So I got firsthand history in the making, and so I want to share a few things with you about what happened before and then what happened after GATT and NAFTA. And so I am going to be, I told them last night, I take out my watch and watch it carefully, although I've got a person here in the front who's going to remind me that my 15 minutes is up. When you talk about international trade, one of the things that our goals here was to get law students involved and have them see that international trade is both fascinating and it's something that you should consider in going into practice of law. When we talk about international trade, we think back in the old days, we think of the Silk Road, where the nations in Europe and Mesopotamia were going across the steppes and through over to China with trade. And then we think about, well, you go to the Port of Savannah. We've got the head of the executive director of the port coming here today to talk with us. And but you go down there and you see all these big ships that are a couple of football fields long coming in to the port. And we think of that as international trade, but behind it is all the law and all the traditions that have happened over the years and have resulted in things we're dealing with today. First of all, most people don't realize that we had the first general agreement on tariffs and trades in 1947. That was the aegis of a new international attempt to bring together and basically come up with methods of companies and countries cooperating in facilitating trade. That was basically just a skeleton of what ultimately became in the 90s when we started negotiating the GATT, became that body of law and that body of tradition that we came up with when we finally finalized the trade agreement in 1995. In that particular, the first GATT, the drawback was that it was an effort to not tear down trade barriers, but it was more an effort to codify and come up with methodologies of cooperation. For instance, one of the things that they had and they established was basically the most favored nation agreement. That was that if you were cooperating together, you would be able to then in turn give benefits to that other trading nation with you. For instance, if you were in the sugar business and you had you did not have barriers in your country, although we did have quotas, that you would then grant to other countries with whom you were trading a status that gave them a reduction in fees, duties, or whatever. So that was one of the first things in the process. The second, of course, was the issue of how to protect your country against the unfair trade practices of other countries. And what developed during this time were a number of processes, but the two main processes were the use of anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties against countries that one, from the standpoint of anti-dumping duties, you basically were looking at a way to prevent them from a country from selling into your country goods at less than what they were selling in the exporting country. The second thing, of course, was if you provided subsidies to your industry, and I'll use the sugar industry because we had a lot of that going on. For instance, the EU has a subsidy for their sugar production in the EU. As a result, the U.S. sugar industry back in the early 80s filed a complaint with the International Trade Commission here to get imposition of countervailing duties on the EU. The process for these types of prevention or remedies was that, one, you first went to the industry, not a company, but the industry went to the trade ambassador and said, we have this problem going on. We have to prove that, one, it is impacting our industry, that it basically displaces our own domestic industry as far as sales, and that three, we expect it to go on, and that we have not been able to, in negotiations on our own, to get it stopped. So from that standpoint, the International Trade Commission is then tasked with the hearing of these complaints, and in turn will issue a ruling, and in this case, the countervailing duties were imposed on the EU for this unfair trade practice. The other area that, from the standpoint of anti-dumping, I was directly involved in an example, and I'm going to use examples because that's memory peg for you. But the sugar industry had a methodology because of the sugar refining industry. In 1982, we had a quotas placed on all of our supplies coming in from 40 different countries in order to protect the domestic industry. We would then were allowed to bring in non-quota sugar, that is low-duty sugar, to refine and then re-export. Well, we were doing a lot of re-exporting of sugar to Canada. Canada then looked at us and said, oh, you guys are selling into the Canadian market for less than you were selling into the domestic market. Well, that was true because we were exporting world sugars and going into a world sugar price market, and we did so. But their own equivalent of International Trade Commission found that we were dumping sugars into Canada, and they imposed anti-dumping duties, and those duties are still on today. But those are just two examples of what was going on prior to our negotiation of the GATT and the negotiation of NAFTA. The one thing that we had, and of course, it's an example too of what happened. If you remember, and maybe you've seen me back in the 80s, the U.S. was looking at the Japanese market, looking at how many cars were coming in from Toyota and all of the Japanese, and they were able to negotiate with the Japanese a limit to the amount of cars they were bringing into the United States because they were basically impacting our domestic car-making industry, and so that's another example of what was going on prior to GATT. The problem with that whole process was a long and arduous process which took maybe a couple of years. It wasn't quick, it wasn't really effective. But one of the other things that was going on at the same time was a problem that all of the countries had their own duties set up in various and sundry classifications, and you were, if you were exporter, you were exporting into a country, and you had to know their system of duties and their system of classification of goods and what the tariffs were on them. And each country was sort of like having an old biblical where the situation was that the group of people suddenly they were talking different languages and nobody could understand what everybody else was saying. The same thing was happening here. And as a result, in the late 80s, prior to the negotiation of the GATT and NAFTA, we had an agreement in the old GATT with the GATT countries that we would harmonize those tariff sections so that, and David Stepp, who is my partner, will be talking about some of these issues later on in the morning. But basically, we had a harmonized tariff schedule that every country followed, so that if you were in sugar, you had Chapter 18, and you had the different duties, the different classifications, the different types of sugars, and every country used those. So that was one of the basic. Are you showing me 5 minutes to go? One of the basic things. Now, moving quickly then to the new GATT, we began the negotiation with countries in new GATT in the late 80s. In 90 to 94, we negotiated those first in Brussels and then in Geneva. The 3 goals of that were: 1, we wanted to have we were looking at tearing down trade barriers. And those in turn, in order to tear them down, we had a system that everyone went to tariffication. That is, your trade barriers became duties, and those duties were across the board. Everyone went into tariffication. Secondly, we agreed that we would reduce those duties by a certain percent over a 6-7 year period. The third thing that we did was they set up the World Trade Court. The beauty of the World Trade Court was that essentially, instead of going through the old international trade type of system, where we went to the International Trade Commission and then had those decisions imposed and countervailing duties and those nature, we then set up this process when you had an industry that was being impacted by unfair trade practice. You go and you first start negotiations. You get your trade ambassadors start negotiations and informal negotiations with the country, try to reduce that. Secondly, then you would then, if that didn't happen, you would then file for an arbitration panel to look at the details, and then in turn they would come up with a decision. Yes, the World Trade Court needs to handle this. No, the World Trade Court does not need to handle this. And if you got positive that the World Trade Court, then you had they were impaneled, and then they moved through a really court type procedure and made a decision. The one thing about it was that, for you to understand, is it was when you got a positive decision of the World Trade Court, which meant that they agreed that there was unfair trade practice, that country that was the offending country was then fined, but it was fined in a way of reducing or imposing duties, higher duties on some of their goods coming to the United States. For instance, we imposed higher duties on Canadian lumber. Canada fired back, and we've had all sorts of things since then. But basically, in Mexico, there were some imports. Those all were then basically tarified into a penalty on other goods and services that country was sending in. 2 things about the new system. One is it has provided us with a methodology to do something that solves problems without a lot of penalties. Also, from the standpoint that it provides us with protection. As an example, in 1982, when the U.S. imposed quotas on sugars, we had a situation where we had 6 cargoes of sugar coming from Brazil. Brazil announced after those, we had received 1 cargo that they were not going to send us any more of those cargoes. They just broke contract. Well, we didn't have a gunboat to go down there and sit off the coast of Brazil and say, if you don't do it, we'll bomb you. So we had to go to the Secretary of Agriculture and get them to then, in some bilateral agreements, come up with a way to force Brazil to back off. And in this case, they put our sugar issue at the top of the agenda for the next bilateral talk, and we got a call from Brazil and said, we'll work it out, which we did. But those are no longer the case. Now you have a methodology that protects you. We're going to be talking about, and this will be from Professor Linarelli, the bilateral agreements that have come up since then. NAFTA, and I'm running over them. NAFTA was a sideline, but a very important agreement. Is a bilateral agreement between 3 countries. The difficulty was that we negotiated it, and we had a provision that said after 7 years, there were no duties on goods coming from Mexico. It did not give Canada that situation, so we've had some problems now with NAFTA in that Mexico is like a 51st state. It can send goods back and forth, no duties and things like this, and in the sugar industry, suddenly NAFTA, southern Mexico has overproduced sugar, and they're sending in and impacting the sugar industry drastically now. So there are always good things, bad things, things that you did not expect to happen, unexpected consequences that were going up. But again, the same kind of system, if they're unfair trade practice, you deal with it in a logical manner. So I'm going to stop and make room for the other panelists, and then we'll have Professor Titshaw ask some questions, or ask the questions you've given us. So I encourage you to put down questions. We'll be glad to talk about it. Okay, great.
All right, thank you, Joel. All right, first of all, thanks to Mercer, the Business School and Law School, and Brian Cade for inviting me to be here today. This is a first for me as a business guy coming out of the financial world to speak at a law symposium, and especially to present, you can be here, but also to present. I'm essentially a finance guy that came up through the consulting ranks of KPMG and Deloitte. I then went into the corporate world and did M&A deals for U.S. manufacturing companies, primarily in the textile and wire industry. As a deal guy, I've worked with hundreds of lawyers over the years around the world and sat through many of their lectures, so it's nice to be talking to you guys, current and future lawyers, and nobody in the room can bill me. So. I follow international trade in a very different way. I really follow the actual manufacturing and the M&A deals that the manufacturing companies are doing to see where people are going. I talk to a lot of my contacts around the world. When I'm visiting China, I'm in China a couple times a year now. I lived there, I've been in and out of China for the last 10 years, and moving back there next week. I talked to a lot of U.S. executives that are over there managing the U.S. investments in China. Mostly in the manufacturing sector, but more and more in the services sector as China is opening up some of the financial markets. I see strong U.S. and European investment continuing in China, but I think it's going to be done on a much more rational basis going forward than we saw 8 or 10 years ago. Back then, to me, it was kind of like a drunken love fest. The U.S. and European companies looked at the size of the market in China and how fast it was growing and thought, God, it's going to be easy over there to make an investment and get a return. A lot of companies, including Superior Essex, where I was in charge of international M&A, I remember going to board meetings and saying things like, we can go into China. If we get a third of the market share there that we have in Europe and the U.S., our investments make sense. So we followed our own customers into China. We sold wire to the motor manufacturers who went there for the cheap labor and the looser environmental standards. They asked us to follow them so they have a supplier they would know and trust. But it wasn't long after we got there, they were using local suppliers to beat us up on price and terms. I think before the pressure of the last business cycle, U.S. and European companies, we gave away a lot in the market in China, a little bit at every step of the process. We work with and pay foreign suppliers a little bit more for our raw materials than Chinese suppliers because We knew them better and we trusted them more. We bring in top managers for all of our different functions from Europe and the US, and we pay them, very nice salaries. We have their families living there. It was quite expensive instead of hiring local managers, again, because we weren't comfortable with the local managers. We pay our staff more than our competitors. We thought we had to recruit them away from the local Chinese companies and to retain them. But I think in the last few years we've learned that most of the Chinese workers, for the same money, would rather work for a US company than a Chinese company. We also follow all the labor laws. We pay all the overtime. We pay 2 or 3 times the salary rate on holidays. Our local competitors would pay the minimum monthly salary and get as many hours out of their workers as they could and not really worry too much about the laws they were supposed to be following. We'd also import most of our machinery instead of buying locally. We assumed our machines were better. We also spent a lot of money meeting corporate health and safety laws, or rules, that made a lot of sense, but it was something that our local competitors, it wasn't built into their cost structure, so it put us at a bit of a disadvantage. But I think US companies are getting better in a lot of these areas, especially as companies lean on their Chinese operations to make up for profits they're not seeing anymore in the US and Europe, waiting for those markets to come back. A lot of localized management. There are a lot fewer expats in China these days, and a lot more local Chinese managers for US companies and European companies. We've also gotten a lot better at qualifying local suppliers. We might not use them, we may qualify them and then use them as leverage with our current suppliers, foreign investment suppliers that we went there with, but we're at least getting them in the mix and saving money there. We've also started buying most of the equipment locally. At Superior Essex, when I was over there, when we first built our factory, all of the equipment came in from the US. When we did our first expansion, we bought a few machines locally, brought in the rest from the US, but now all the machines are being sourced locally if they're available. The Chinese quickly closed the gap on the quality gap that we saw in production equipment. 8 or 10 years ago, there was enough of a gap that it made sense to bring in equipment from overseas. But in the late 90s, in the textile industry, it was common to hear of used equipment from the US and Europe being traded up and sold into China. The Chinese government didn't care because it was creating jobs there. But by the mid-2000s, when we were building the wire plant, trying to bring in used equipment from factories we were reducing or shutting down in Europe and the US, the Chinese government had changed their policy. The current policy encouraged the import of new equipment, but made it difficult and expensive to bring in the used equipment. So you can really see how the policy had gone from just hoping to create jobs to supporting their local industry, the equipment manufacturers. That really helped them close the quality gap. They were getting a lot of business, and they were seeing a lot of machines that were being brought in that they could learn from. All in all, I get a sense that the US companies are operating better. I think the Chinese government is starting to level the playing field a little bit. Not nearly as much as they say they are, but at least it's going in the right direction. But just as the US investments in China are kind of maturing and starting to make some sense, I'm starting to see and hear about Chinese companies coming to the US. They're tripping over different things though. Primarily what I'm seeing is the IP rights, intellectual property rights. I think some of our panelists will probably speak to that later in the day. Just one example. Sinovel is the largest wind turbine manufacturer in China. They had, I think, 8 plants in the US. They've shut those all down now because they got in trouble after stealing some technology from a US supplier. The US supplier tried to sue them in the Chinese courts, which wasn't real effective, but once the Chinese companies are in the US and subject to the US courts, the people that have they can get some traction there, enforcing their rights. So when I speak to manufacturing companies in China today, I hear a lot of them that talk about coming to the US, but they're worried because they don't understand our business practices. They saw what we did over there and knew we didn't know what we were doing. So they don't want to make the same mistakes when they come here. Some of them are talking about sending their children to US schools, expecting them to be educated here, work here for a few years. And they're all doing it with an eye towards the long-term view and expanding back into the US. I've seen estimates that Chinese investments in the US this year is going to reach $10 billion. I think we're going to see that, new records every year for a while. As more Chinese invest in the US, it's going to snowball because the newcomers will have more connections from companies back home that they can rely on. Just like we followed our customer and worked with other foreign investment suppliers in China, the Chinese companies coming to the US are going to do the same thing. The one story I particularly liked was about International Vitamin Corporation in New Jersey. This was an investment by the Chinese. When I was traveling in and out of China, and even today, it never ceases to amaze me the number of supplements and vitamins the Chinese were buying overseas to bring back to China because they were worried about the safety of their local brands. IBC is a U.S. company. They're making vitamins in New Jersey. I guess in 2010, they were acquired by some Chinese investors. They have one Chinese employee, which is the CEO. The rest, it's all 100% U.S. employees and manufacturing. But they spent hundreds of millions of dollars in the last 3 years gearing up to start to sell vitamins and minerals, or vitamins and supplements into China, all with the Made in the USA label. Vitamins aren't the only new hot exports to China. Everyone's heard about the early textile and garment industry migration to China following the cheap labor. The Made in the USA label's got a lot of press lately. What's also excited some of my old textile industry colleagues for the first time in years. These were people that weren't too happy in the last 2 years. It's certainly gained traction in the US with smaller brands promoting themselves. But in Asia, the consumers are driving the whole trend. The well-off consumers are buying up Made in the USA clothes without even thinking about the price. They see Made in the USA as signs of quality, but also as a statement about their own success, and it's a fashion statement for them. If you spend any time in the high-end malls in Japan or Korea and China, you'll see lots of Made in the USA items, not just vitamins. One thing, dress boots, dress shoes and work boots. You see Red Wing boots all over China. I think most of those boots are going to be in restaurants. They're not going out on the factory floor for the common workers. I laugh when I see Woolwich flannel shirts in China. I grew up in Vermont. Flannel is corporate casual in most companies, especially during deer season. I find it hilarious to see the hip crowds in Shanghai buying flannel shirts to wear out on the weekends. I'm also hearing stories from friends in the customs brokerage world that they're seeing more and more high-end toys being exported into China. I think this is the U.S. toy manufacturers, one, exploiting the Made in the USA brand, but they're also taking advantage of the mistrust instilled in the Chinese consumers after some of the local producers had trouble with all the lead paint toys, just like we saw in the U.S. Okay, another trend I want to talk about, it caught my eye a few months ago. I don't even know if it's a trend yet, but I think it's going to be. And it's not related just to China, but it's the whole adaptive, or what a lot of people know as 3D printing. There's some amazing stories out there about this technology. GE's VP of Advanced Technology expects that within 4 years, some of their jet engines are going to be flying with parts that are 3D printed. It says that within 4 years, it's possible they could be printing the entire engine. GE currently has 600 engineers working to commercialize this technology. So it's going to have an impact. I'm just not sure yet what it will be. The Chinese are printing human organs using living cells instead of plastics to print with. In Belgium, there's an 83-year-old woman living with a 3D printed jawbone who can chew and speak just like the rest of us. I always read about 3D printing as a way to speed up the prototype process, but didn't think of it as something that would radically change manufacturing or impact international trade. The 3D printers are in development that are suitable for manufacture of finished products because of their increased speed and the different materials they can print with. They also lend themselves to mass customization, where one-off products cost the same as mass-produced products. We all know that shoe and sneaker companies rely on cheap labor. Well, Nike's now using 3D printing technology to prototype and produce shoes for NFL players. New Balance is using it to produce custom-fit shoes for athletes. As cool as all this sounds, it really didn't hit me how big this might be until I saw an article about a month ago in Time about NASA's plan to use 3D printers starting next year in space. They're going to use printers to print replacement products, or replacement parts, even heat-resistant rocket parts, so they don't have to carry everything with them when they go up into space. I thought to myself, well, if NASA can make replacement parts in space, why couldn't a manufacturing plant make replacement parts in the factory instead of having downtime or waiting for specialized parts to be designed and built? And then I thought, well, if you're making replacement parts, why not just print the actual product and forget the production machines? So it was kind of a silly cycle I was there in my thoughts, but my real point with this is adaptive printing is quickly going from cutting down prototype costs to an actual means of production. Coming from the manufacturing world, it makes me wonder what this means for where and how goods will be produced, especially the more labor-intensive products. I mean, imagine the impact of international trade if you walk into a shoe store, instead of a stock room full of shoes from a low labor cost country, there's a 3D printer there. So, as the technology gets faster and faster and more efficient, we're going to see more and more final production using these printers. I think it's going to go first from the R&D lab where they're making prototypes to the maintenance shop where they're going to make replacement parts. But pretty soon, we're going to see it making the final products that we're buying in stores, possibly making those products in the stores for us. So, for the purposes of this symposium today, I don't have any answers, but I think it's something to think about. These technologies are going to change where and how products are made, especially the products that are chasing cheap labor around the globe. So, that's what I've got for now, and I encourage any questions. If I can share any more, I will. Thank you.
I see this while I'm talking. Another way to do that. Well, this goes forward. Good. Well, hello. Thank you for inviting me here. It's great to be here. I've been here since Tuesday. It's been a wonderful trip. I want to thank the Law Review staff for just doing a marvelous job of organizing this conference. I know how much it goes with that planning, takes some time and effort, and you've done an incredible job. And I want to thank President Jones as well for working really hard diligently with me over this past week and getting here. There's no jet lag. I have to say, something about having a good airport is really important for international trade, and you've got one here. That makes you accessible, I think, which makes you internationally competitive in Georgia. And that's something that not every country or state can say. But I wanted to tell you, as you can tell from my accent, I was born and raised in Southwest Wales. I am the dean of the British Law School, which is an interesting fact in and of itself, but I wanted to give you a greeting from Wales. And sometimes when I have to do talks to entering students or at graduation, I spend a lot of time memorizing things and trying to understand how to do it to pay proper respect to this very alive language that people do speak in Wales. So I should try to do this in my mid-Atlantic monotone sounding voice, but I think it's Joki Kiam Fi Wagoff. Thank you for inviting me. Mine would be Quad Yama. It's great to be here, so I'm sure I butchered that. But you can, I sometimes do this in class and students all laugh, so this is what I want to talk about today. That's the way trade agreements, that's the imagery we can use for trade agreements in the world today. And that's how it's really been historically for centuries, going back to the Renaissance probably, or even before then. It's what's been known as the spaghetti bowl of trade agreements. And this is a word that Richard Baldwin, I didn't coin this, Richard Baldwin has written very famous, done some very influential research on this question. This is his diagram from his work, and this is just the Americas. So it's an interesting dilemma, I would say, how to manage these trade agreements. I mean, from the standpoint of management by governments, in terms of trade negotiation, in terms of management by companies, in terms of, supply chain management. And it's really affected, I think, the way we do things. Now, one of the things I want to discuss is how did this happen? Because we have this thing called the World Trade Organization, that's multilateral rather than regional or bilateral. And those are very important concepts in this discussion. So that's only one bowl, okay? But we're supposed to have this, the multilateral order, right? And so the way the multilateral order is supposed to work is that it's a set of agreements. You sign up to the WTO as a country, you become a WTO member, and you have no choice but to join all of these agreements, right? There's agreements on goods. These are some of the more important agreements on goods. There's agreements on service. There's a GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, and there's TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. Well, let's just look at some of these. I understand it used to be, and Joel talked a lot about tariffs and quotas, and that's what we have in the world trade system is progressive trade liberalization. That's the words that trade negotiators use, right? Progressive trade liberalization. So we start with tariffs and we kind of zero out tariffs. Now we're on to non-tariff barriers. So multilateral agreements on trade and goods. Well, the original 47 GATT, now we have the 94 GATT. Agriculture. If you look at agriculture, you will understand that this is not about something called a free market. There's no such thing as a free market. We'll talk about that in a minute. But agriculture is a highly allocated, planned global allocation of goods from inefficient producers in America, Europe, and elsewhere that prejudices developing country producers. So there's no such thing as a free market in these agreements. The phytosanitary measures deal with environmental standards. You can see these beyond the border, now going beyond the border, right? Technical barriers to trade, product standards. And I brought a television to the UK. I thought for sure it wasn't going to work. I bought a converter, spent $150 on a converter. I get there and I find out now with digitization of television, you can take an American TV anywhere. Just plug it into the satellite system and it works. Product standards, right? Subsidies and countervailing measures. How do you deal with subsidies? It's government intervention in the market. The market is what we make it. It's a bunch of rules, which we decide what those rules are going to be. Safeguards and sort of emergency measures. The GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which has annexes covering movement of natural persons, not very much yet. Air transport, financial services, banking. Try to do banking. But sort of the multinationals have it covered. As an individual who has roots in a bunch of different places, it can drive me absolutely bananas. But some banks will cater to it. Shipping, telecommunications, maybe someday we'll add legal services. There are discussions going on about legal services right now. The United States is a net exporter of legal services. But it depends on what you mean by exporting and importing services. Most of the large law firms in the world are multinational, like their clients. They happen to have headquarters in the United States, but they also have significant global presences. Right? The border is a transaction cost to these firms, right? Then we have TRIPS, very substantive, doesn't have anything to do with tariffs. What that regulates is, we're going to find out later, sort of substantive intellectual property law, harmonization of that. Dispute settlement understanding, hundreds and hundreds of cases in legally binding dispute settlement in the WTO. The bilateral arrangements also have similar dispute settlement understandings. So that's the WTO. So why do we have the spaghetti bowl if we have this? That's the question. And does the spaghetti bowl somehow take away from this massive multilateral infrastructure that we've put in place? Why are countries abandoning, it seems, the WTO? I don't know. But we can go back to Jacob Viner, a very famous economist, American economist, who talked about distinguishing between trade creation and trade diversion. And I'm not an economist, but in a nutshell, what Professor Weiner's talking about here is this. If you and I set up we're two countries and we set up a trade agreement and we divert trade from other countries, in other words, we just move it around, we reallocate trade. Remember, markets are just a bunch of rules, right? So we can reallocate trade, right? From country A to country B and C. Well, that's just trade diverting. It's not producing any net gains in trade, right? What we want regional trade agreements to do is to create trade, to facilitate more trade, to more progressively liberalize, to use the word, right? The WTO rules reflect these concepts, right? And you have to notify regional trade agreements to the WTO. The WTO can really do nothing about them. You know, the Doha round, so the way you do progressive with the trade liberalization of the WTO, you have multilateral, you have ministerial rounds, they're called, ministerial conferences, and you have built-in agendas into this substantial set of agreements. If you go onto the WTO website, you will see a very nice website with all the agreements, all the DSU cases. It's fantastic. The problem is when you try to negotiate things with many, many countries, well, I mean, that just, the costs of cooperating multilaterally are very high, right? It's just easier to divide them up and do regional trade agreements. You know, if I have to have 10 people in a room agreeing to something, it's just simpler to have 2. And then I go to the other 2, and, you know, and I cut my deals, right? So this is what's happening, right? Countries are increasingly relying on bilateral regional agreements. In fact, 2 years ago, Professor Muhammad approached me about rewriting the entire casebook on this subject. He said, all the casebooks are wrong because they focus on the WTO. We need to do something that focuses on all the bilateral regional trade agreements and customs union, like the European Union, for example, which is a customs union. Well, that would be a casebook on its own. But, so that's what we see happening, and there's so many. In fact, there's a standard form that the U.S. Trade Representative has. It's just like you learned about standard form contracts and contract law. Now there's standard form free trade agreements that have, they're very much substantially similar. Some of them don't produce much trade at all. Some of them are very significant, you know. So the reason I put Back to the Future there, if you look at the beginning of my paper, which will get published, none of you have it, but I go to send it to the law reviewer. I'm about half of it done. It's, you'll see there that if we go back hundreds of years, even thousands, you will see that this was always the case. That bilateralism was always the nature of trade agreements that have gone on back to the Genoese, the Italian city-states. You know, I mean, before the Peace of Westphalia that created the modern nation-state, we had bilateral and regional trade agreements, right? So, I mean, trade has always been about institutions, you know? So I always find it fascinating. There's this moment of kind of awakening. I don't know if other professors here have this. If you teach international business transactions to students who are exposed to international commercial and trade law for the first time, there's this kind of moment where they go, I didn't know there were so many rules, you know, in the international level. How could that possibly be, this superabundance of rules? And I start to then explore that, and I say, well, do you think there are more rules in, say, you know, Kansas or the state we're in than there is perhaps on the international plane? I said, I haven't added in all the non-economic rules yet. I mean, the WTO is only the public side of trade law. It's the regulatory side that applies to government action. We haven't even talked about the private law side, right? And, you know, the private law side, if you go back historically, and before the 19th century, was international law. You had the law of nations, you had the law of merchants, and they were transnational in their conception, right? You can go back and dig through old English law opinions, and you'll see Lord Mansfield in the sort of late Middle Ages saying, we're going to incorporate commercial law into the common law. Right? Really, commercial law only became a state project with codification in the 19th century. So, I think students come into the class thinking that international means kind of, some sort of Hobbesian state of nature, I mean, it's a great example of how ideas matter, We're all working in some system of legal or political thought when we do law. I mean, we just are. And so Hobbes said, you need a sovereign to have law, otherwise you just have life nasty, brutish, and short, right? And there's no such thing as international law, because how can there be? There's no sovereign to produce the order that we need, right? And you can then sort of contrast him with Grotius, who's widely considered to be the father of international law, early modern, really, I guess I can call him a political philosopher. He wrote treatises to justify colonial expansion for the Dutch, right? That was his job. Grotius was a natural lawyer. He said it wasn't institutions that created law, it was reason, right? Yeah, we just as natural lawyers can find self-evident principles that can govern our actions in the international plane. But really what we are now is, that idea about Hobbes is we're all stuck in kind of ideas that we have inherited. So, the idea that we need a sovereign comes from something called legal positivism, English legal positivism. The other side of it is, the sort of legal realism, which wants to give us a sort of policy-based approach. But really what we have here is a really serious set of institutions. These institutions are created by rules. We make them. They are social practices, right? These institutions have always been mandatory and coercive, always. I mean, trade was something, gunboat diplomacy, colonization. These were all arguments for, trade was always a state-directed, shall we say, prince-directed, before the Peace of Westphalia, enterprise of forcing markets to open, right? Whether we wanted to open them or not. Go back and look at Locke, who talks about the labor theory of value. He says, if you're not tilling the land, I can take it, right? Because it's being wasted by the Native American, right? This was the justification for opening up trade. So, they substantially affect domestic economies in the contemporary world and constitutional orders. That list of agreements that I provided you from the WTO substantially affect what we do as a political community. If we think that politics is only national, well, these agreements intrude very much. They are federal law. They are the law of the land. That's what the U.S. Constitution calls them, right? They intrude substantially into our domestic constitutional order. And I would add to that where you happen to be born is simply a lottery. It's morally arbitrary. What society you happen to be born in, how lucky or unlucky you happen to be. I'm not talking about investing in the stock market, I'm talking about brute luck, as we call it in philosophy, right? All these factors come together, I think, along with the fact that international law is an extensive set of rules. It's a system of law affecting the lives of many persons. We want these rules to be fair. So what I'm getting to here is that I think the next move for the WTO has to be more along the lines of not just simply being a place where power is the operating principle. In other words, what I can get. Coming up with a bunch of rules based on how powerful my country or how persuasive my negotiators happen to be. I think we have to apply principles which transcend that kind of approach if we want the WTO to have any sort of legitimacy. What is it offering that we can't get bilaterally at this point? Nothing. So, well, it does, but I'm exaggerating. But my point is that I think we have to look at questions like this. Do the least well-off who may be affected by a trade agreement have reason to reject? Not from just self-interest, but reasons. Right? So we need to focus on reciprocity and impartiality. The argument here is essentially you are asking me to bear disproportionate burden or hardship. Now, let me give you an example how markets are created by rules. When I was coming here from Wales, I got a ride from, we use a car, we hire a car from San UK. We have a service the university has to take us to airports. I was talking to the driver, and he says, I haven't done this all the time. I used to be working in a Ford plant that we used to have in Swansea. It was dawn. We were driving by, and he said, there it was. It was right there. It's completely vacant, right? He says, Ford has moved everything out of here except for down the road in Bridgend. They've got an engine plant. And I said, he says, what they did, he says, was, you know, in the UK we have more flexible labor laws like you have in the United States. He says, but the other plants in Spain and Germany have very restrictive labor laws. So they made a decision to close this plant. I don't know if this is true or not, but it sounded compelling to me. And he says, they made a decision to close the plant because they know they could just pay us a week's pay and terminate our contracts, but they couldn't do that in Spain and Germany, so they kept the plants open. The rules matter, right? This is not a state of nature. There is no such thing when we're talking about any market that is of any size or complexity. So how we get these rules right is very important, and I think that the WTO now has to be really seriously understood in these ways. I think legitimacy should play an important part of this discussion, not just progressive trade liberalization based on power. So that's just a little thing from John Maynard Keynes, which I always like to cite to top my own horn as a professor. But anyway, so anyways, thank you for having me here, and thank you.
Okay, I have one question right here, and I see a couple of others moving up here, so I'll start with this one. And this was about, and I guess, Joel, I'll start with you, but anyone else can chime in, but since there was a discussion about sort of trade conflicts and anti-dumping actions, this question was whether there's an inconsistency or what tension there is between anti-dumping actions and antitrust concerns or laws, and whether you see an inconsistency there and whether it's a problem.
I think that what you're looking at is you're looking at two different systems. Antitrust is because people collude and try to set markets and try to grab advantages, but in the anti-dumping, it's more of a country and an industry getting together to basically protect themselves from these what you call unfair trade practices. So there are two different sets of things.
Okay, how about this? Do you believe an agreement on the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, the Titshaw, will be reached? And if so, when? Any knowledge of that or those negotiations?
I think that probably the difficulty right now is that we are in the what Professor just laid out for us. We're in bilateral agreements, and in reality, the use of the World Trade Organization is to protect yourself, but then all the trading is going to ultimately get on a one-to-one. There are 125 new bilateral agreements that have been negotiated since the last 10 years, and there are many more being negotiated. As the Professor pointed out, it's easier to come up with an agreement that between two parties than between 40 nations. And so I think that this type of overall arching type agreement is going to be dodo bird in the next few years.
Dodo bird, I like. So I'm thinking about continuing on with the future, and this was actually directed to John Linarelli initially, but y'all can chime in if you want to as well. It was what motivations exist and are likely to be effective for human beings to focus on impartiality and reciprocity rather than just power in changing the system?
Well, this is a question about behavior versus what we ought to do. So what I'm suggesting to you is has a normative aspect to it, which is how we ought to behave. We all know that we have rules in the legal system and we have moral principles about how we ought to do things, and we oftentimes violate them. That is a problem. I don't deny it. But if we lose our sight of what we ought to do, then we are certainly lost. I think also I think there is some movement now towards government starting to think about these questions, because for reasons having to do with, they're instrumental reasons, for reasons having to do with self-interest. Because if you enter into agreement or a treaty that lacks legitimacy, it doesn't have a compliance aspect. In other words, what reasons do I have to respect that? What sort of a claim does it make on me to say this is the right thing that's being done? If we don't have a just legal order, then what are we doing? I mean, that's the question we have to ask ourselves. That's what it's for.
Do either of y'all have something
Yeah,
to add about how to make this realistic?
It's only getting more difficult.
Realistic?
As the Eastern world becomes more important, there's that whole, the morals are different. I mean, the boss in the U.S. is maybe, you look at a visual, the boss is 20% more important than everybody else. Over in Asia, the boss is 120% more important than anybody else. So it's just a whole different mentality and how they, so I think it makes it more difficult to span East and West and multiple
Well, these are principles of political morality. So
Wow.
there are things we have to, there's a lot of things we agree on. I know we tend to focus on everything we disagree about, like that rule, which is not a moral principle, it's more of a rule of sort of etiquette or prudence. So there are a lot of things we actually do agree on. It's just a matter of sitting down and understanding what those things are. They will be a much smaller subset of things than we would like, but I'm not talking about, when I use the word morality, I'm not talking about kind of comprehensive moral principles about how one lives one's life. That's not on the table. We're talking about very simple concepts about how you should organize a decent society and let you sort of live your life the way you want to live it, giving you the sort of means to do it, not interfering in those principles. I mean, that sounds like Western liberalism, doesn't it? We're going to give you the all-purpose means, John Rawls says, to live your life in the way you should live it, but that you want to live it, as long as you don't harm others. But that does give us some sort of thought about how we want to start thinking. I mean, this is just a very limited principle I've come up with, which is just about distributive justice. It has nothing to do with corrective justice, which would be what we would be applying in a legal system, for example. So we could all agree on many things. If I go out in the parking lot right now and take a hammer to somebody's car, I did something wrong, and I should pay for that, or I should maybe go to jail for that, right? I think everybody agrees on these sorts of basic principles of corrective justice or retributive justice, or whatever. So those are the kind of commonalities you look for in these kinds of discussions. It's a lot of work.
Thinking in terms of the workers, you've got to understand that in the United States we have this system and labor unions and all of this that are concerned about the workers and their right. You've got to understand that 10 years ago, when we were, 20 years ago now, when we were negotiating the GATT, China wasn't also around. It was Japanese, Koreans. They were the ones that we go home and try to come up with agreements to help get them to the table. China was not a force in the international community. Now, China is the biggest force in the international community, and they have several procedures that are different from ours, including they pushed all of it, they wanted, as they got new factories and they created new trade and new customers in the world, they pushed the rural area into the city to help provide the workers. When they had a pickup the last couple of years, they've had people who are not working, but they underwrite their ability. And now, 3 weeks ago in the New York Times, there was an article that because the agrarian society, these people are saying, let's go, I want to go back to the rural area. I'm living in poverty here, I'm living in a smaller, I had a better standard of living there. The government has now come in and said, we're building these new condominiums. Certainly each of the major cities will be all of these new buildings that the people who are from the rural area are going to be living in, subsidized, free, for purposes of they are moving their economy up and creating the jobs that they can make exports to the world. And we're seeing that as a change in the European Union and the United States. It's more focused on the workers. China focuses on trade, and the government is looking at how we can be the 1,000-pound gorilla. They already are from the standpoint of the United States because they own more of our bonds than anybody else. And so therefore, if they get sick, we really get sicker.
That's, actually, it's interesting. Joel just hit on one aspect and partially answered the next question that I had here, which is how the Trans-Pacific Partnership will affect the world trading system. And I think this is asking a little bit about the future, and I'm assuming by Trans-Pacific Partnership, we're meaning China and America, China and the United States,
No,
China,
it's
America?
pivot to Asia. It's the administration's pivot to Asia,
Gotcha.
in which China is not a part of yet, but they're thinking about becoming a part.
So what do y'all think, what effects or will that pivot have?
I'm unfamiliar with the agreement, but I think what I see, I travel within international seas, I have to say amazing. It's the investment levels, unprecedented infrastructure. They take universities seriously. I'm not answering your question, but
how about the focus, the fact that we are focusing on Asia and China in particular, and as Joel mentioned, they have a lot more weight to what we consider likely to happen in the future. How is that likely affecting or going to affect the directions we go in? Or do you see any effect, any change? How's that?
I'll answer Penny's question this way. If Japan, Korea, and China get together, we're in trouble. Basically, that's the kind of, what's happening in World War II, but that's the kind of axis that you don't want to happen. So therefore, you've got to, we as EU and the other nations, international nations, the first world nations, we've got to come up with a methodology to understand their problems and to then make way for them. And so therefore, they will be, in the next 10 years, they will be the big dogs that basically wag the rest of the world. And if we don't understand that, to watch, you know.
But yeah, add to something that Joel said earlier about the debt issue. So, I mean, Chinese are investing in our bonds and taking the return. And what do you think they're investing in? I mean, part of that goes to defense spending. I have a kind of joke about how we're actually financing the People's Liberation Army. But also, we're the other way around. They are also paying for, one thing I noticed living in Europe is how much money we spend in the United States on our military, and how little we spend on welfare of citizens. No wonder people don't want to pay taxes in the United States. We're not getting anything for that. So I think the issue, from my perspective, is that produces interdependence. Why would we want to? That interdependence produces peace. Why are we going to, in antagonize each other. We need to cooperate with each other for our mutual gain. So I think these agreements are, and I think that's how the administrations, presidential administrations historically looked at these agreements. Because we need interdependence, because interdependence means we have a stake in each other's success. And so I think these things are really important to push. I think APEC is going to be the next mechanism probably for these kinds of interactions.
I have a question for Greg now, which is how can, and this is a much more micro question, how can a small textile or high-end product that, I guess a textile company or someone who makes a high-end product in the U.S. That has some recognition or niche prestige here, how can they gain access to the Chinese market and distribute their exports there? What advice do you have?
Just distributing, it's due diligence on the partners over there. I mean, if most people in China now have got some other clients in the U.S., so you need to talk to a lot of people to find out, are they going to protect your channel? And you've got to, depending if you're going to produce over there, what we did in the wire companies is the enamel that we used to coat the wires, we would make a precursor for it, and we would make the final mix in China so that the actual formula wasn't known. Eventually, we knew it was going to get reverse engineered, but if you're producing over there, you've got to keep some of the secrets outside of China. If you're just distributing in there, it's just due diligence on your partner.
I have one last question to sort of wrap up, but I'm going to ask it to each of you. So I guess maybe we'll go in the order we did initially and start with Joel. But what do you think, where do you think that the international trade system will be in 20 years? What do you think will have changed significantly? If you stick out one thing if you want.
I think that because the GATT provides the glue that keeps the rules going, they will still be there because of the problems we have, just like the courts provide. If we've been offended, we sue for civil work, we've got violent law. But on the other hand, as we've heard here, bilateralism is going to continue. I mean, you're going to have those kinds of things because it's easier. And because of these major countries who have different attitudes, they've seen that bilateralism is much better than having one big, okay, to come together, or trade barriers. You can do it with simple one-on-one rather than trying to force things off. So therefore, Doha Round had 3 years of negotiations with nothing happening. I mean, basically, it was because everybody was saying, why should I lower my tariffs even more? The goal was, we're going to have zero tariffs. But basically, that's not going to happen. And so they showed with their inaction where they were from the standpoint of GATT.
Great.
Yeah, I think it's so. The bilateral deals are they're going to come close, become more similar to each other. I don't think you're going to take the giant step. I mean, we can talk conceptually about that, but I think real world, it's going to be the bilateral deals getting more similar.
How about regional deals? Do you see expanded regional deals as well? Or?
I don't know.
By deals, I guess I mean agreements.
I think that's right. Regional trade agreements is the
Right.
say. No, I think it's just gradual. I mean, one thing that WTO does is a very innovative step was it put this multilateral infrastructure, which we now have an intergovernmental organization engaged in this. I think accession of new members continues on. It takes forever to do accession because it's just you have to go to each country and do your deals. And, it's really long. So you'll see more focus on accession on the agenda. I don't know what's going to happen with the rounds. It's a good question, but I just think it'll be probably continue on, muddle on as business as usual. There won't be fundamental reform of the institution as an organization. Unless something new happens that I'm unaware of. I have to say I don't totally follow always what's going on in the WTO, but I don't see, when I talk about these shifts towards a more legitimate institution, there are talks about that. I hear people from WTO even talking about it, but they can't do anything about it. So So I think it'll be a very gradual thing.
Great. Well, so I think we have some consensus to leave on about where to look for change, and I'll move on to the next panel.
First panel, that was great. We're going to try to keep on time here, and so the next panel, if you would come down and take your places, you're going to get panel number 2, Chris Smith, who is the practicing lawyer here again. They will be the first moderator of this panel, and Chris is a counsel for Denmark. Yes, sir. So we have general thank you so much, Chris. Incidentally, outside on the table, registration table, last year we I was asked to write a chapter in both got that excerpt.